Hi, Nina. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm doing fine. Today, we're talking about chapter three, entitled Learning, Merging Signals Outside the Head with the Signals Inside. So, going from signals outside to in, and now the fun part, the integration. Yeah, kind of in going back and reading through the chapter again, I really felt that it was sort of the crux of the book in a way.
It
It
is.
reminds me of how, like on albums, the third track is always the hit single for some reason. Did you feel that way writing it?
Yes. I mean, I don't know if I felt that way writing it, but I feel that way now in retrospect.
Got it. Yeah. And something that I was thinking about while reading it too is something that Ian always says is that, science thinks that it's understood something when it's broken it down into its component parts, but then it fails to reintegrate that and connect it to the whole, to the lived experience, which is really where all the important stuff, the meaning and the richness is. And I feel that what you've done here for the science of hearing is that you have shown that reintegration process. You've done that reintegration process and have connected it back to human lived experience. Um, has this been something that you've sort of always felt, or is it something that you developed along the way, learning about the auditory
What?
system?
What is it? Is this something that you felt all the way along? What is it?
So that it being the experience of sound um, through the efferent system is changing our default response to sound. So this learning piece that changes how we experience sound. Has this always been something that you thought of, or is it?
No, it's something that has evolved in my thinking over time. And first of all, let me say, because I'm always um, humbled and delighted when you make any kind of a comparison to the work that I do and Ian McGilchrist's work. It certainly is my desire to take the nitty-gritty of science and to talk about it and to think about it in a way that is stripped of the reductionist parts to the extent that we can stand back and think about, well, what does this really mean in a more holistic manner? So that certainly is something that increasingly I've been working on, and something that I'm working really hard on in kind of everything that I do in my teaching and my writing. But yes, I think that the learning chapter is very important because and the framework that I have put together, with the beams hypothesis, is just a really nice, convenient way, I think, of 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 getting a snapshot, if you will, of the different forces at play, and putting it under a rubric of you know, efferent processing, and the B for brain, the E for efferent, and the A for afferent, and the M for memory for sound. That's just a way of thinking of very, very complex and interrelated ideas kind of parsimoniously. And I had really uh, I came up with the beams hypothesis after I wrote chapter three.
Mhm.
And so, if I wish I had come up with it before, because I would have actually put it into the book. But I think it was the process of putting in all of the information that is in chapter three into some kind of a coherent whole that brought me to the 400 word beam hypothesis instead of however many words the chapter three is. But I hope that people do read it and take it to heart, because even though I don't call it beams, that's the idea.
Yeah, and I'll definitely we'll attach the beams hypothesis. It's a really elegant PDF that you can get through quickly, and it's a great acronym too. Um,
Yeah, as in scaffolding.
right? And I do think that with the book, I love that you added all the human experiences too. Like for example, you're talking about learning a Dire Straits solo, and a child that I think it was the grandchild of your piano tuner or piano teacher, who their mom is a was it a violinist, a strings player, a horn
Or,
player.
mhm.
That's right. And so when they're listening to some piece, when the horn started, even though they're sleeping, they woke up, and it's so beautiful that we have these changed default responses to sound from our experience.
Absolutely. And this is why it is so important. I mean, we are what we do. And even in utero, this baby, this grandbaby of my piano teacher, experienced his mommy playing the horn, and this was a familiar sound. And so, even though the baby was sound asleep in his grandfather's arms, he or she could just respond to this familiar music.
Yeah,
Uh, so it is important. It's important that we make good choices, and I think this is related to something I hope we will talk about later. But, the idea of, all the time that we spend on digital devices, for example, really has an impact on our brain and what we become. And so, if we can understand this better and we can um, adjust our values accordingly, informed, I think, from science, and I think the
mhm,
combination of science and clinical work really work together to
yeah.
to give us some guidance about what kinds of choices are best for us.
Yeah, it's such a, it's such a paradigm shift in the field of hearing, especially because, I think there's to some degree we sort of know that, oh, health and fitness, like you can, change your body by doing these practices. But with something that's more invisible and intangible, I think, I've certainly never thought about it until reading this book that you're shaping this like sound body that you have over time. I was talking to my friend the other day who's a really awesome musician. He's a bassist and a cello player, and he went to go see Les Paul recently. And Les Paul came out, and he was really when he walked on stage, he was like really hunched over, and he was like, "Oh man, he looks old." And he went over to the front of the stage, and then he picked up the guitar, and it was his positioning. He looked so natural carrying the guitar. It was like that position that he had, you know, from thousands and thousands of hours of playing had sort of changed his posture in such a way that
Yeah.
this was like natural for him. And so I think we do a similar thing with our sound mind. And it's really great that we have this lens because now, again, like you're saying, we have some agency over how to shape it in a way.
Mhm. But I think we knew a lot of these things on some level. I mean, the science is just a way to additionally inform us, inform, what every grandmother would probably tell you, that
Right.
stop looking at that screen, uh, start uh,
Sit up straight. Yeah.
sit up straight,
Yeah.
make some music, sing a song with me.
Yeah. Yeah. We always got to get back to the grandma advice. It's the best. Um, so, for one of the things that you mentioned, such a cool story, and I think for maybe any skeptics out there that like, oh, how much really can we change our hearing? You have a really great story about some psychedelic owls. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the owl story is a wonderful story because it really connects the dots in terms of the nitty-gritty neuroscience and how our brain changes with experience. So, we know that we're very good at localizing sound. And we have known for quite some time that there are neurons, especially in the upper brainstem in the superior olivary complex, that are really good at detecting differences in time and loudness between the ears. So interaural, as in AURAL, interaural time and interaural intensity differences. And there are neurons that are organized in a very systematic fashion to respond to changes in ITD and ITL, um, level and timing differences. I don't think I have those acronyms exactly right. ILD, interoral level differences, interoral time differences, ITD and ILD. So we know that these neurons exist in the normal system, and scientists were wondering, well, okay, if we alter the system, can we alter the maps? And this is something that has been done in a lot of experiments,
Mm,
especially in terms of cortical maps. There are maps of the body and maps of sound and space too, and visual space.
mm,
And, either through disorder or disease or through experimental manipulations, we have understood more about them. But now the owl is a tremendous, he really relies on hearing for survival. He does most of his hunting at night, and if he's going to be able to catch a mouse or whatever it is that his prey is, he has to be able to locate it using his sound localization cues, which are way, way, way better than any human's ability to localize sound.
mm,
And so they wondered, okay, well, if we took the animal's visual space, because he has a map of where, say, a mouse is in space that corresponds to his auditory cues. And if we were to shift it, put on these psychedelic prisms and just basically shift the map of visual space, say 30 degrees, so that something that might look as though it's straight ahead is actually shifted 30 degrees to the right or the left.
mm,
And they wondered whether the animal would learn, first of all, to adapt to the new map, which it did. So it didn't go hungry. So after, a couple of days, the animal learned to do this. And they were also wondering, well, what about these maps, these intraoral time and level differences maps in the brain? Would they shift? And they also shifted.
mm.
And so, you could kind of see this plasticity in action. And also if you took the prisms away, eventually, you use it or lose it.
Yeah.
Eventually, that goes away, the ability to do this. And one of the things that they discovered was, well, not only that there is this map of space, but also that they thought that, oh, well, this plasticity was just something that you would see in younger animals. And they wondered whether you could see it in older animals as well. And they did it in initial experiments in older animals, and they didn't find the same kind of plasticity. And they thought, oh, well, then there must be sort of a special sensitive time when the animal can learn these things. But it turned out not to be the case at all, because even the older animals, if you had a different learning strategy, which I think is very important to think about in terms of clinical practice,
Mm,
they found that in the younger animals, if you shifted the visual field by 30 degrees, the younger animal was able to make that adjustment and his maps changed accordingly. With the older animals, if they started with a 30-degree shift, the animals didn't seem to be able to relearn or to learn how to align their visual and auditory space maps.
yeah.
But if they took the strategy of making the shifts smaller so that they just shifted, say, 8 degrees at a time, then the older animal, in fact, was able to learn in just the same amount of time that the younger animal could learn, and
Mm,
his maps also changed. So, I mean, I think that demonstrates biologically a number of things. It certainly demonstrates that we continue to learn and that our hearing brain continues to be malleable until we die, until we're very old. And there's another really great example, and there's a wonderful book that you should also have our listeners get at some point. Here's another
yeah.
neuroscientist, and his name is Ken Kenneth Catania, and I have his book here. It's called Great
Great adaptations.
Adaptations. First of all, he writes the way I would love to write, because he really does bring in a lot of personal stories, and he talks about very technical things in ways that I can understand them because I'm not an evolutionary biologist. And one of the animals he talks about is the star-nosed mole, which is kind of a very strange looking
Whoa.
animal. And this mole is a burrowing creature, and he's blind.
Hmm.
Um, and so if he's going to figure out where food is, he has to do so by touch and by vibration.
Hmm.
And this is kind of similar to what other moles, like the naked mole rat that Peter Narens, who is an auditory neuroscientist, who's one of my my scientific heroes, and he's actually the one who recommended that I read this book. Peter Narens has done a bunch of work showing that moles are able to sense vibration, because of bone conduction, through their big jaws, they can sense vibrations in space that are happening in a desert, say a mile away.
Hmm.
If there are leaves or there are branches of reeds of grass that are moving, that will set up a vibration that the mole can sense, so that he will know that if there are if there is a vibration, if there is a shaking of the grass, that means that there are going to be critters there that the mole can eat.
That's so cool.
So they have extraordinary abilities, and this too, this is it's the star-nosed mole is very sensitive to vibration, and it's kind of, you can think of it as a form of touch. And
Hmm.
I think we might have talked before about how sound and perceiving sound is touch at a distance.
Yeah.
And back to the maps, this guy Catania has done a bunch of actual mapping in the brains of these animals, showing that these animals and that the appendages on the star nose of the mole rat correspond to different areas in space, similar to rat and cat whiskers,
Hmm.
who have a similar sort of mapping. So this is a fundamental evolutionary principle that really teaches us a lot about
Hmm.
how the brain is organized, A of all, and importantly, how it can be modified, what happens in the brain when an organism learns, and how these maps, it's just very easy to comprehend that.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are a billion other things that we don't know about that are harder to comprehend, but it's
Hmm.
easy to comprehend that through learning, your map of this or that can be altered.
Yeah. Wow. That's so cool. Yeah, it does seem just the perfect analog to sound because it's just vibration through a different medium, right? That they're sensing. I wonder if there's like some analog of music in the waving of the grass or something that they find beautiful about it. Um, that's really cool. We'll add in those books, great adaptations, and then also Peter Narren's. Um, yeah, and it seems like, you mentioned the note about owls who are older, maybe they can't change very, that entire 30, what is it, 30 degrees, instantaneously. But, it makes sense in that you want some level of stability, right, for your system, or else the world would be too chaotic. Uh, you'd be remapping things all the time, and that would also be not adaptive because your experience over time is in a way a reflection of the things that you do most often. So you're sort of uh, in your ecological niche, let's say, you're most adapted to what things you're going to do.
And it also makes sense that as you're older and you have more and more years of experience and reinforcing that the world is a certain way, that it would be a little bit more difficult to change. You become a set in your ways for good reasons.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not just a bad thing. It's not just a rigidity. It's
Yeah.
it's really helpful. And this, It's about as close as we can get to maybe the biological underpinnings of wisdom.
That's right. That's another point of the owl, right? It's a symbol of wisdom. And how do we
Yeah,
measure it?
yeah,
Yeah. Well, something that I also felt was so cool is you mentioned, how in the owl they're remapping, basically at the level of the midbrain. But you were also describing how experience changes the afferent pathway at literally all the levels of the auditory pathway, which is really amazing. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about, for example, the cochlea, like what's going on even at the very, sort of fundamental levels of the auditory system.
yeah. I mean, so probably the most peripheral part of the hearing system is the pinna, is right. And it turns out that the movements of the pin, at least in some animals, is where you can measure it better, and they have more pinna mobility than humans do. But that the movements of the eyes and the ear are aligned, certainly in the cochlea and in the cochlea of humans, really of any mammal. We have these inner and outer hair cells that we learn about in school, and but there's one inner hair cell to every three outer hair cells. So there are three times as many outer hair cells than inner hair cells, and yet most of auditory neuroscience has been focused on the inner hair cells because that's sort of the afferent pathway. That's what connects to the cochlea, to the eighth nerve, and then to the rest of the brain. But there's this constant feedback through the outer hair cells, which is the efferent system, and is something that my mentor and friend and just again another hero of mine, Peter Dallas, he has done beautiful, beautiful work. He was able to understand way before anybody else that it was the outer hair cells that carried so much important information in terms
Mhm.
of perception.
Yeah,
And so the outer hair cells um, create, among other things, otoacoustic emissions, which are sounds that can actually be measured in the ear canal. They're actually vibrations and sounds created by the ear, which is just incredible to think. It's as though
Mm.
your eye is producing light. Well, here your ear is producing sound. And these products of the outer hair cells are affected by activity in the midbrain, in the cortex. They very much affect learning. We know that musicians have stronger, if you will, otoacoustic emissions, presumably because musicians have super fine tuning with respect to sound in the efferent system. So, and I listed a bunch of things at the end of the chapter about what the outer hair cells and the efferent system tells us about changes that are happening right at the cochlea from the central nervous system. I mean, I think that's just great.
yeah. And the fact I think you had a quote that was like the ear is hearing the brain. I just thought that that was really cool because it's a reframing of everything such that rather than us being this individual player of an instrument, let's say, we're kind of this whole orchestra. There are all these different players that are coming together and making this beautiful thing happen. And you also mentioned that it's a new way, and this perked my interest as a speech therapist, that you can do infant hearing screenings with these acoustic emissions,
Mhm.
which is really really cool because there's so many kids. Well, infants are nonverbal, but then there are so many kids who get older and are still nonverbal and don't have a way to communicate whether or not they've heard a sound. So
Yeah.
it seems like a
Yeah,
great.
but you should know that basically if you can still have normal otoacoustic emissions and a functioning cochlea, but you can still have auditory neuropathy or some
Mhm.
kind of condition that makes it difficult to hear and understand sound or auditory processing disorder.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so we have to be very careful. Uh, you know, there are hardly ever yes and no answers. I mean, yes, we do use these otoacoustic emissions for hearing screening, and that can tell you. I mean, if a child fails the screening, that's telling you that there's a problem. If he passes, it's telling you that his cochlea is working, but it's not telling you anything else about the rest of the auditory pathway,
Yeah.
which is most of the hearing problems, in fact, do originate in the cochlea. So it is certainly a great way of catching kids who may have a hearing loss early.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not, it's not the only, you can't say, okay, so they've passed the otoacoustic emissions, they've got normal hearing. I mean, in
Right.
fact, people with, and I write about this even in the book, I think it is in chapter 3. One of the people I talk about is somebody who has auditory neuropathy and completely normal, beautiful, in fact, extraordinary otoacoustic emissions,
Hmm.
and yet they're functionally deaf in noise
Hmm.
because they're with auditory neuropathy, it's a loss of neural synchrony, which I think is very much something that happens with different kinds of auditory processing disorders. I think
Hmm.
auditory neuropathy is an extreme case, but I think that there are many gradations, which is why I think that people, speech pathologists, every speech pathologist should know how to run an FFR, a frequency following response, to be able to actually see, well, is the neural synchrony, is there a biological reason why this child may or may not have an auditory processing disorder? And
Yeah.
I think you really want to know, yes, there is, or no, there isn't.
Well, I really hope that we can a little bit through these talks, and I hope to get the word out too, about all of these different things that could go wrong in hearing, which very strongly affect speech and language outcomes. I'm thinking of so many kids that I've had on my caseload where there's ear infections, middle ear infections, and you mentioned this with the ferret where they occluded one ear, and then there's kind of a difficulty in sound localization and things like that. And I've had so many kids that have had frequent ear infections that have had really long-standing speech problems, which then change very fundamental aspects of their life. Like, even with the parent, it's like if you're not saying something and the parent's always like, what are you saying? Or they get angry with you because you're saying it wrong. Why can't you say it this way? Those very basic things will change their perception of their own speech and their confidence. And, all of these, they have these wide ranging effects that you might not, think would just come from frequent ear infections as a child.
Yeah, yeah. And our fields are so blindfolded to those things and those effects, like in speech pathology, a lot of the focus is on speech production.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
a lot of people don't realize, and certainly parents will not necessarily realize, that the reason their child is not producing the sound well is because they're not hearing it. They're
Yeah.
not hearing it, the way they're not hearing these fine-grained distinctions that rely on neural synchrony, for example.
The neural synchrony piece is so cool too because you mentioned all these different ways that the neurons respond, which is for me like not being a neuroscientist, it's a little overwhelming that there's different response patterns at like every way station, for example. Like at the I think you mentioned in the midbrain you have the like sustained, the chopper,
Yeah,
pauser, things like
that's
that.
already in the cochlear nucleus. And it's kind of remarkable, really, that but again, this is sort of the reductionist science, that like we know that there are different cell types, so that anatomically these cells look different, and
Hmm.
functionally they behave differently in response to the same sound, and yet we don't really know, why. Like, how does this all
Yeah.
fit together? So,
Yeah.
we just keep fishing.
I wanted to know actually if you uh, had, so, for example, you gave an example, and I think this is in the auditory cortex, but where like a ferret is responding, they have these preferred neurons that respond to 8,000 hertz. But if the 6,000 hertz tone becomes very important, they'll recruit neurons from around to respond to that 6,000 hertz tone. I'm wondering how context dependent that is. So I'm thinking of, for example, learning in a human, like when I go into I don't know, a store or something, I might hear the same beep as in a song, but they mean totally different things depending on the context. How context dependent is learning in this
I
way?
think it's hugely context. I mean, I think the whole premise of the book and of chapter 3 is how, the hearing brain is vast and it depends on what we know. And so what we know is context.
Hmm.
And so, if you are hearing particular timbres or particular frequencies as a musician, the context in which it occurs is really important. Where, that's kind of where, there's this whole field of psychoacoustics where we often break things down to tones and simple stimuli of particular durations and frequencies. And yet so much of how we perceive these things cannot just be broken down to individual parts because the sum of the parts, as I think Ian would agree, is a different creature.
Yeah, maybe was it you or Ian who made the point that if I'm having a conversation with my wife on the phone, if you do like spectral analysis or something, you'll never get to the the meaning of that conversation in lived experience, which is yeah, easy example. Another thing I was thinking about was how many different types of learning mechanisms there were. So, there's obviously the different response types for the neurons. But, you mentioned that like when a sound takes on new meaning, it can, speed up its rate, it can recruit different neurons, it can go to a new or commandeer a new location even on the tonotopic map. Yeah,
It can
and
inhibit.
it can inhibit. Yeah, it's one thing that I remember learning in like every class in cog sci was like neurons that fire together wire together, like the Hebbian plasticity thing. But then, I remember reading in the matter with things also that there's a lot more types of learning that can occur. Like you can have a neurotransmitter that switches at the synapse to learning, or you can have homeostatic mechanisms. So upregulation may cause compensatory downregulation, things like that. Um, yeah, make it, yeah, again, like you're saying, like science likes to pretend that, oh, we have these, uh, we know what these little parts do. We understand the story, but there's so many levels.
Yeah, we understand little bits of it.
Yeah. Well, it's cool to think that there's so much more to learn, even though we do know a lot. Like in this book, it was almost like, man, it's take me a lifetime to really process all of the things that are going on. And maybe this kind of leads into the end of the chapter, which is a little bit of a departure, but I think it's really, really important, is about attention. So when we have experience, it's now we know, okay, experience is changing our default response to sound. But like thinking about experience and what we attend to, I think it's so mysterious that we do attend to what we attend to, like our interest in things as infants, for example. What exactly is it driven by? I know we have, as humans, we have kind of broad overlap in the things that are important to us, like survival and social interaction. But then there's this huge set of idiosyncratic stuff. Like some people really like music. Some people within music are drawn to, I don't know, distorted guitars. Other people like the sound of the bass clarinet. I don't know. Yeah, that's just something kind of mysterious.
Yeah, but I think it is true that, you know, and this is again part of the hearing brain is vast because we learn we learn our brain changes, we learn what we care about. And the things we care about, for whatever reason, because it's bringing us food, because it's bringing us comfort, because we like it for some reason or we don't like it, we pay attention. And so it's this combination of the things that we pay attention to, that we link with effective learning. I think that that's
Absolutely.
really one of the very important. I mean, making music really feeds into that mechanism just beautifully, because as a musician, or anyone who makes music, you're paying attention to sound. And that attention is very important for changing your brain and for then learning all kinds of other things.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the limbic system being a big part of that learning. And music, the other awesome thing that it does is it can connect us to deep emotions when we listen. It is really something that, as a speech therapist, as in language development, I realize how underappreciated attention is in, you know, one of the basic issues that we see when we're working with young families that maybe their child's not talking. It's really the ability to pay attention to, form joint attention with the parent. So, for example, if they're, you know, both looking at a ball, being able to point to it, look back up at the parent, and look back down at the ball, forming that triadic joint engagement is the basis of how you learn what a ball is, and all of these other things. And when that breaks down, you don't see language. And one little technique that we've used is just to use music.
Yeah, but it's completely underutilized. I mean, as a speech pathologist, when do you ever recommend music?
Right. Well, it not in grad school for sure.
This is your um, this is part of your mission.
Yeah. I think we touched on the main parts, and I'm excited to explore what kind of this all means for the rest of the book. The fact that, sound changes us is sort of the foundation on which the rest of the book sort of builds. And, it does give us agency, like we mentioned, in terms of how we choose to understand and live our lives in sound, and how we might raise kids in this new generation, understanding that their sonic environment is affecting them. And maybe something that we'll mention in the future or talk about later is how in this new modern digital world, there's so many, kind of in the same way that, like, maybe ultra processed food is like all over the place, and a lot of people are seeing disease and things like that come from overeating particular things. We haven't been thinking about how our sonic consumption is maybe changing us and our kids.
Well, Garrett, if you would please, why don't you mention what you brought up at the beginning before you began recording? Just the whole idea that the incidence of language disorders, language development disorders, speech pathology problems has been very much on the rise. Could you let people know about that? Because I think it's important for sort of the topic of what we might be able to do about it therapeutically.
Yeah, absolutely. So during the pandemic times, the CDC mentioned that the incidence of communication disorders, especially in infants, rose like 110%, something like more than doubled. So, and then it's continuing to rise. And anecdotally, being a clinician, you just get more and more referrals. There's been more and more referrals. I've seen more and more kids with more severe problems. And with that, not saying that there's, a proven causal mechanism, but that there has been this very stark correlation between the amount of time spent on digital devices, the amount of digital noise in the home, and severity of speech and language problems. And you could think of this manifesting in a bunch of ways. The most simple one being that the more time spent on devices is the less time spent in a rich interpersonal interaction where most of our language and our sonic language experience comes from. But also in this thinking about the sound mind, um, as a child, you're doing all this incredible pattern recognition, and if you have let's say, increased noise in this signal to noise ratio, it's going to be harder for you to, it's kind of like if you have hearing problems, it's going to be harder for you to make those strong connections. And so if you can imagine, if you're hearing a lot of uh, even language coming out of the phone that's like unrelated to something that you're really seeing in front of you, that's, talking about all kinds of random stuff. It's filled with a lot of beeps and boops, and it's a noisy signal that's decontextualized. You can imagine that it might have effects on how your sound mind is developing, especially at the age when it's so plastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have also been some real foundational studies, people who have studied language, like think of Pat Cool, and trying to remember this other very important luminary who has done a lot of work on child development, finding that as they're teaching kids sounds of different languages, especially when they were very young infants and sort of plastic, more able to hear these different sounds, that that if the training was done kind of online or even through a mirror, it wasn't as effective as person to person training for learning.
Yeah.
So I think that that's really important information that we should never forget about.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I think that more and more, even as speech pathologists become more digital, and they're yeah, it's not as convenient. You have to find parking. You have to, it takes more time to see a person in person. But if your goal is to teach your child to speak better and to hear better and to communicate better through language, there's really something lost in the digital speech pathologist,
Yeah.
that you really gain by being in person.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's the thing that, you're connecting us all back to the book. It's just connecting everything back to this lived human experience in sound. And I think if I had learned this way when I was younger, it would have been a different. I would have been way more interested because I think when I was younger, I was learning about different. They might have talked about a hair cell or something like that. I was just like, how does this connect to me listening to Led Zeppelin, or whatever it is, and so at that time it was like this. It felt like this very, not that it was totally boring and uninteresting. I did like it, but it didn't have the same connection to what the amazing thing that we're doing all the time, living in sound. So thank you for writing this chapter in this book.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for reading it. Thank you for encouraging others to read it. And thank you for doing what you can to broaden the purview of speech pathology, especially to include music as a form of enriching language development.
Oh, I really appreciate that. And thank you so much. I know you have to get going to your next podcast, but it's always wonderful to talk to you. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.